Time for us to begin. Glad to see everyone this morning. This is our last lesson in our study of the harmony of the Gospels. Next week, Jerry begins a study on Isaiah, right? So look forward to that. Today we're going to talk about the final events of Jesus' life on earth, his burial, his resurrection, and the material that I sent out has some information on the witnesses to his resurrection, and then some things about his ascension and the ongoing efforts. His resurrection wasn't the end of things. It was just kind of the beginning relative to his reign on David's throne. And so as our time permits, we'll look at some of that, but you have the material, you can look at that. First of all, we want to look at the burial of Jesus, and all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, include information about his burial. In Matthew, the 27th chapter, one of the things that the burial is talked about in verses 57 through 60, but go down to verses 62 and 66 and talks about the concern of the Jewish leaders. They seem to remember more things than some of Jesus' disciples did, because they go to Pilate and they say, we remember that when he was alive, he said that after 3 days he would be raised. So they were concerned about his disciples, his followers, coming and stealing the body away, making it appear as though he had been raised from the dead. And so you remember what Pilate tells them. He tells them to go and make it as secure. He says, you have a guard, go and make it as secure as you can. This, to me at least, this is not a Roman guard. This is the palace guards that he tells them to take and go make the tomb secure. Later on, we'll talk a little bit more about what happened to these guards and some of the things that they were told to do. But the point is, they set the guard, they sealed the tomb, and this sealing was, sometimes we think of putting a ring around the stone to seal it off, but you remember there's instances where they would use wax and they'd have a signet ring, and they would stamp that ring in the wax, and a seal would secure a document. I think when he says they sealed the tomb, this was some clay that they put on it, and they put some kind of seal in that clay. So if the rock was moved from the tomb, that seal would be broken, and they would know that someone had entered in. That's what I get out of it. But does anyone have any different thoughts than that? But as you read down through the Gospels about his burial, Mark says in Mark the 15th chapter, beginning about verse 42, that it was evening. It says when evening had come, and then he also said it was the preparation day, which meant what? Preparation for what? It was preparation for the Sabbath, right? So this would be on Friday that he says that it was the day before the Sabbath. It was the preparation day. Joseph of Arimathea, Luke records, requested the body And Matthew talks about him being a prominent member of the council of the Sanhedrin. Other of them talk about him being a follower of Jesus, but kind of secretly, because he didn't want anyone else to know. A little bit like Nicodemus was, who came to Jesus. John 19 talks about Nicodemus also assisting with the burial of Jesus. And then if you go back to John the 3rd chapter, you find that he was a ruler. He was a fairly prominent man as well. And probably based upon John the 7th chapter and verse 50, he was a member of the Sanhedrin just like Joseph was. He said about 100 pounds, I think, one version says, of spices, myrrh and aloe. And they used this, put it on the body, and then wrapped the body up to prevent some of the stench of the body as it decayed in the tomb. But one of the in Mark the 15th chapter, when Joseph came and asked Pilate for the body, that he might take it down from the cross and bury it, because they didn't like bodies being hung out during the Passover. So they wanted the body down. So Joseph comes to Pilate and he asks, but Pilate, according to Mark's account, wanted confirmation that Jesus was dead, because he was kind of surprised that he would have died so quickly. And so he summons one of the centurions that was watching the cross there, and confirms through the centurion that Jesus was in fact dead. And he releases the body to Joseph to be buried. Joseph and Nicodemus wrapped the body in linen. You need to keep that in your mind as we go through this a little bit further. Whose tomb was this that they buried him in? Pardon? It's in Joseph's tomb, wasn't it? In fact, in one of the accounts says that it's one that Joseph had hewn out of the rocks. And so the implication is it was a tomb that he had prepared for himself. It was a new tomb. No one else had ever been buried there before. And so they buried him in that tomb. Who else was present during all of this process? Nicodemus. Anyone else? Two women, weren't there? Mary Magdalene, and a couple of the versions just say the other Mary. One version says the mother of Joseph. I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that. And it just says that when they left the tomb, they just saw where the body was buried. They just observed where the body was placed. As Joseph and Nicodemus prepared the body and put it in the tomb, put the stone over the opening to the tomb and that sort of thing. They just observed that. Then it says that they left and went and prepared spices. They were going, after the Sabbath, they were going to wash the body. They were going to prepare it for final burial, because this was kind of a hurried up process with Joseph and Nicodemus in order to get this done while it was still evening. So that's about all that the Gospels have to say about his burial. Took him down from the cross, wrapped him in linen, put him in the tomb, and rolled the stone over the opening to the tomb, and then the Jewish leaders were concerned about his body being stolen. And so this is the time they apparently set the guard and seal the tomb. Now, talk about his resurrection. Yeah, Joe?
Even in his death, we talked about the last words last week, it was finished, but even after his death, he was still fulfilling things were said about Isaiah, and that he was put in that tomb of the original.
Yeah. Yes, Ron?
The behavior of Joseph of Arimathea here is interesting. Member of the council, and so he's kind of one of them. But John's account says that he was a disciple, but secretly.
Yeah.
And that now he's found some courage, which is very interesting.
I think that's a good point too. You need to kind of keep that in mind about he and Nicodemus both were kind of secretive about their relationship with Christ throughout the time that he was here upon the earth. But as you begin to think about the witnesses to his resurrection, what some of them were like before and what some of them were like afterwards, it's a big transition on the part of a lot of them. And I think that's kind of what you see here with Joseph and Nicodemus. Yes, Gerald?
I think it's interesting also that they, two different people, gather stuff to put, spices to put on Christ's body. Like you said, to keep it from deteriorating fast or something. Which indicates to me that none of them believed that he was going to be raised.
I think that's right. I think when you look at the reaction of his disciples, when you look at the reaction of these women that kind of followed along through this whole process, and you look at what Joseph and Nicodemus did, I think they thought this was over. In fact, you look, is ended in John's account where Jesus appears to the two men on the road to Emmaus, and they said, we had hoped that this was the one who would restore the kingdom to Israel. I think they just kind of concluded, it's over, it's done, he's been crucified. I don't think they thought much about all the things he had told them about his death and his resurrection while he was still alive. I think they just kind of put that out of their mind. Yes?
Since we're talking about Isaiah and Joe and Myrrh, when Isaiah talks about him being buried like a rich man, it's not only the tomb. When you talk about burying him with a pound of aloes and myrrh, in today's money, that's in excess of $256,000. Just myrrh is very expensive.
Yeah, well, Joseph was obviously a fairly well-to-do man as well as Nicodemus. But anyway, they went through all this process, and then 3 days later, he is raised. And as we talk about the resurrection, one of the things I want you to keep in the back of your mind is it hasn't been too long prior to this when Jesus raised who from the grave? Lazarus. Keep in mind the resurrection of Lazarus and some of the events that take place and are recorded relative to the resurrection of Lazarus. From my standpoint, it always, when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus and coming forth from the tomb and the linen that was wrapped around the body and all of that, it always makes me think of the resurrection of Lazarus, because I don't think we get a real appreciation of some of the things that are said about the resurrection of Jesus without thinking about Lazarus' resurrection. Now there's an obvious difference between the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of Lazarus. Jesus was raised to die no more. Lazarus died again. So there's that difference, but there's some other significant things. You remember when Jesus came to the tomb of Lazarus, what did he tell the people to do first of all? What did they have to do to get Lazarus out of the tomb? Move the stone. And then when Lazarus came out, how did he look? He was wrapped with all of the grave clothes, wasn't he? And they had to take those off. Keep those couple of things in mind as we go through some of this. First of all, I don't know about you, as I read through the 4 accounts, they all give a little different perspective of the events that take place at his resurrection. And some of it kind of confuses me, I'll admit. So maybe you can straighten it out as we go through it. First of all, look at what Matthew says. In Matthew 28, it says, "There was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it, and the guard shook for fear of him and became like dead men." Is there any need to roll back the stone for Jesus to get out of the tomb? No, not really. That was for the access of the women and Peter and John. Not for Jesus to leave the tomb, but for them to get in. Mark just says that the women saw a young man in a long white robe sitting in the tomb. Mark doesn't give any of the details about the angel coming, the earthquake, and the rolling away of the stone. He just says what the women saw when they looked in the tomb is they saw this young man in shining garments sitting in the tomb. Look at Luke's account. He says, Peter went into the tomb and saw the linen cloth lying by itself. Talk a little bit more about that in a minute. John records that Peter and John came to the tomb. Peter goes in. You remember John's account says that after the women had left the tomb and went and told Peter and John and some of the others that he was gone, they thought someone had just taken the body and they didn't know where he had been taken. And so Peter and John run to the tomb. Who gets there first? John gets there first, doesn't he? But he stops. What does Peter do? Typical old Peter. He just charges right in, doesn't he? And then John's account says that Peter goes in and sees the linen cloth lying there and the handkerchief that had been around his head not lying with the linen cloth but folded together in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who came to the tomb first went in also. Now here's a phrase that you need to be sure and keep in your mind. This would have been John. Then the other disciple who came to the tomb first went in also and saw and believed. What did he see? Saw what Peter saw, didn't he? The linen cloth lying there and the handkerchief folded. To me, that has always been significant. I don't know about you, but I'll just tell you some of my thoughts about this. That's all they are, my thoughts. Is that there's some significance to the fact that John records the linen cloths lying there, the linen that had wrapped the body. They had some significance to what Peter and John saw, because they saw that was all there was to see. They saw and believed. Believed what? Joe?
What I've read is the fact that the handkerchief was left separate was a tradition that I will return.
Yeah.
Come back, it's not that.
There is a Hebrew tradition that a folded napkin means I'm coming back. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. If you just wadded your napkin up and put it by the plate, you were through. But if you folded it up and put it there, I read this the other day, found this, but I'd heard it some years before, that a folded napkin indicated whoever was there was going to return. Whether or not that's the indication here, make up your own mind. Yes, Vern?
This is another one that just maybe kind of things, I guess, but if you were going to steal the body, which is what they were worried about, the Romans and the Jews, would you unwrap it and fold it up and go and put it, there, or would you just take it and sneak out?
Well, I think that's it, and that's why I say, think about the resurrection of Lazarus. When he came out of the tomb, they had to take all that off of him, and this was probably not just a 30-second process. And so if there were guards there, and it was the middle of the night, and you were trying to be secretive about this thing, you're going to spend time to take all of this off of the body and place it there in the tomb. I think what John and Peter saw that caused John to believe, what did the linen cloth look like? I think what he saw, and here again, this is what I think he saw, is that the linen cloth was just like it was when it was wrapped around the body. But the body was gone. The body wasn't there. Was there any need for it to be unwrapped, for him to leave the tomb? No. Not if there wasn't any need for the stone to be rolled away. And Matthew's account indicates the stone wasn't rolled away until the women got to the tomb the next morning. Other thoughts? As I say, you read through all four accounts and they're all four from a different perspective. So you kind of have to just take them one at a time, in my opinion. What happened to the soldiers? Matthew says that they were present and aware of this earthquake and the angel coming down, the stone being rolled away, and they saw all of this happen, and then it just says they became as dead. So what do they do now? They go to I think they go to the Sanhedrin, the rulers of the Jews, and say, and then the rulers say, well, just say that you fell asleep. Was that a good position to take? Not as a guard, was it? The issue here that I run into is they tell them that, let me see if I can find it here right quick. he says that they paid him money to say we just fell asleep, and they said if word gets back to Pilate, this is why I don't think it was Roman soldiers, but it was the palace guard that was there at the tomb. If word gets back to Pilate, we'll make it right with you. We'll take care of you. We'll cover you. And so they do that. And it just seems to me that they were aware of some of these things that were happening. They just couldn't do anything about it. Any other thoughts on this process of him being raised?
Gary, they're going to go down lying. There's no intention in any of these guys to say, well, he must have been the Messiah.
Yeah, they're avoiding that as much as possible, aren't they? Any way they can. Terry.
One of the things I really like about John Accounts, he says, and then they believe. If you go back to John chapter 2, it really kind of puts a pin on what he's saying. Because verse 19 says, Jesus answered them and said, destroy the sanctuary, 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, it took 46 years to build the sanctuary, and you raise it up in 3 days. Verse 21, but he was speaking about the sanctuary of the body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered what he said.
Yeah.
Really interesting how John.
There's a major transition. Even some of his fleshly family didn't believe who he said he was. But after this process, you find that they have kind of come around and realized that he's really who he said he was. So yeah, there's a difference in what people heard and understood early on and what they heard and understood later on. Good point. Vern?
Well, I think there's another, you said there's a distinction between Jesus' resurrection and Lazarus, that he rose to die no more, but also, there had been a handful of resurrections throughout history.
Yeah.
Still pretty rare, though, right? And so it'd be kind of hard to believe that happened. But in every other resurrection I can think of, whether it was a prophet that was doing it, or Jesus, or whoever it was somebody raising someone else. He was the resurrector, but in this case, Jesus is the resurrected, and there's no one else who's raising him. So where's the great prophet that's coming to raise Jesus?
Yeah. No one standing outside of his tomb saying, Jesus, come forth, like he did with Lazarus, is
Maybe
there?
that's part of why it was so hard for them to
Yeah.
understand that this was still going to happen, is because they thought he was the guy that does the resurrecting, not the one who's resurrected.
Yeah. All right. Anyone else? Yeah.
Supposedly, this centurion back that we looked at in Mark, he did say, surely this must be the Son of God.
At the cross. Yeah. I think, I'm not sure to what extent he really meant that, but
In the original, a son of God, saying, surely this
was a son of God.
deity, whether
Yeah.
he said,
Kind of like if you go back into Daniel and you look at Nebuchadnezzar after God sent him out into the pasture to be like the animals. He indicates a belief in God, but I'm not sure he recognizes God as the only God. I think there's, in the mind of a lot of those kind of people, there was this, yes, he's deity, but just one of the other deities. That's kind of the impression I get from some of that, but okay. Anyone else? Ron.
You know, there's an importance as well to Peter and John and what they're seeing and not seeing there. When Peter is preaching then on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, you know, he references, in the story that he is telling there, that this Jesus has raised up, of which we are all witnesses. They're starting that process of their witnessing and understanding, seeing and understanding right here in the tomb. And they're speaking with authority, and they're speaking with their information being confirmed. There's multiple people that saw the image.
Yeah.
And then, in the few days that followed, and then, after that, we have the rest of the New Testament history, of the.
Along that line, look at the number of witnesses I've listed down in the material about the witnesses. We see at the tomb he appeared to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary as they were returning from the tomb in Mark and Matthew's account. In Luke, it talks about the two men on the road to Emmaus that Jesus appeared to. Then in Luke, Luke talks about him being seen by Cephas, by Peter, and then he was seen by the 12 apostles. He appeared to the apostles minus Thomas. What was Thomas' attitude toward all this initially? He said, I won't believe it unless I do what? Touch the nail holes in his hands and where the sword pierced him in the side. So even on the part of some of Jesus' closest followers, even after some of these events and some credible people telling them these things have happened, he still didn't believe it until Jesus appeared to the 12 with Thomas present. And Thomas believes then. Then there were 7 disciples by the Sea of Galilee that he appears to. And then, of course, as you get over into 1 Corinthians, Paul says he was seen by Saul on the road to Damascus. And then Paul says by more than 500 people. Some are still alive, he said. If you don't believe me, go ask them, because they were witnesses to that. So the point is, there was a large number of people that were witness to his resurrection, to the fact that he had been raised from the dead. This wasn't just a handful of his closest followers that attested to that fact, but there was, I don't know who all these 500 people were, but there was a plenty of witnesses to that.
Gary,
Yeah.
it's interesting to me that Jesus gave these men everything they needed. They were going out on a job, and that was to affirm with no hesitation that Jesus rose from the dead. And Thomas says, I won't believe it until I do these things. And Jesus doesn't come and chastise him.
Yeah.
Jesus allows him to do exactly what he said. This is what I've got to do. And I'm sure, part of that's the understanding of Jesus that this is
This is something that's not normal. Yeah. When you think about these 12 men, especially as they're being sent out, history records that John was the only one of them that didn't die a martyr's death. I think that's probably the case. But here were men that were getting ready to go out and into a world that was opposed to this in the first place, and they were willing to sacrifice their life. Now, that's pretty strong evidence that what they were saying was credible about his resurrection. Why would you take that position and subject yourself to that kind of persecution and probably death if what you were saying you knew wasn't true in the first place? Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? So as you look at these witnesses and you think about who they were, some of them before the resurrection of Christ, some of them hadn't believed that he was who he said he was. Even his fleshly brothers, if you go back to John the 7th chapter, some of his own family didn't believe that he was the Christ. But afterwards, go over to Acts 1, about verse 4. Acts 1, you find that even this same group of people recognized the significance of what was taking place and what had been done, and they believed. Thomas was skeptical. Some even persecuted him. You think about Saul as he persecuted Christ in the church. Saul think he was doing the right thing? Certainly he did. Because he says, I've lived in all good conscience till this day. He had not done anything that violated his conscience. He thought what he was doing was right in persecuting the church and trying to drive it out of existence. And so when you think about these witnesses that we have recorded in the scripture, these were people that were not gullible people. They were not people that just accepted things on face value. They were people like Thomas that had to be convinced that this was the case. You think Paul had to be convinced that this was the case? Certainly he did. But the thing about Paul is once he was convinced, he did an about face in how he reacted to that. And so I think when you think about all of these witnesses, that the strength of the evidence that they saw, just like John when he comes and looks in the tomb and whatever he sees, whatever caused him to believe, once he saw that, he believed. So the strength of the testimony that they used to convince themselves was strong enough to cause them to kind of set aside any other thoughts that they might have, any other reservations they might have. What was the reaction of the 12 when Jesus was arrested? They fled, didn't they? They went and hid. Even after his crucifixion, where were the 12? They were hiding. They didn't want the Romans or the Jewish leaders to find them. And so they were hiding. And that's why I think they were reluctant when the women came and told them that the tomb was empty. Someone taken his body and we don't know where they've taken it. I think that's why they were a little reluctant, because I'm not sure I want to come out of hiding right now. But look at the transition in them. Just some 40, 50 days later, when Peter preached the first sermon. Joe. Yeah.
here and the kingdom's about a physical life, and they, I'll say, finally turn that corner where they can see beyond.
I think there's a passage in 1 John. Turn over to 1 John 1. This is one of my favorite passages because I think it says a lot about what is taking place here with Jesus. Notice what John says in 1 John 1, beginning in verse 1. He says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled concerning the word of life. The life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness." A couple of things to think about here. One is that, Paul makes a statement. I'm trying to remember this morning where it is. Maybe some of you can tell me. Paul makes a statement, we seem kind of in the flesh no more. Paul came to a deeper understanding of Christ than just his fleshly presence here upon the earth. I think that's what John is saying in 1 John. He says, yes, we've seen him, we've heard the things he said, but he says it's deeper than that. Which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon. It wasn't just a passing thing with John. John said, we have heard him, yes, but we've looked upon him. We've delved into the things that he says and believe the things that he says. Our hands have handled him. Think of Thomas. Thomas, when Jesus allowed him to touch him. Concerning the word of life, the life that was manifested. To me, he's saying the life that Jesus lived was manifested to us even after the resurrection. We've delved into that. We've thought about that. It's not just a passing thing with us. A lot of times people will speak to you and you see them and you hear them, but 5 minutes later you don't even remember who it was. John's saying that's not the case with Jesus. It's not the case with us and our witness to Jesus, because we bear witness now to the resurrected Christ, not just someone that we passed on the street. Any other comments? Our time is pretty well gone. Yeah.
2 Corinthians 5, 15.
2 Corinthians
5:16 is though we have known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him thus no longer. That passage.
Yeah. And I think what Paul is saying is, I think Paul probably was aware of Christ when he was on the earth before his crucifixion. I mean, he was a prominent member, a Jewish leader at that time. And I think that's why he was so opposed to him. But he's saying now we have a deeper understanding. Yes, Byron?
John's making the point here in 1 John 1 that Christ that they've seen and touched and felt and known is synonymous with the Word, which they now have.
Yeah. Good point. Good point. All right, that's our class. Appreciate your comments. Next week, Jerry will start Isaiah.